Hello, class. This is a short presentation over Caribou Cafe. If you were in class today, we did discuss what I'm going to talk about here, but if you weren't in class, and again, that was probably no fault of your own. It was my fault because I could not get our Zoom to work. I wanted to just present a few of the ideas that we talked about over the story itself, because it's a really complex story in a lot of ways. Structurally, it's a complex story. It's got three parts to it, and each part seems to be narrated by a different person. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just take us through some of the specifics in this story to kind of help you gain a better understanding of what this story might mean. What we talked about in class was the idea that using the story of La Llorona is a very useful tool to understanding the unnamed woman in this story, as well as the violence and the disorientation that we feel when we're reading the story. So I'm going to take us through a couple of specific points in the story. It would be really useful if you had your story with you. This way you could kind of follow along with those page numbers. To begin with, the story begins with: they arrived in the secrecy of night, as displaced people often do, stopping over for a week, a month, eventually staying a lifetime. So already from the very beginning, we begin with people, immigrants, arriving in the dead of night to some kind of city, to this urban center, and already they are displaced. And as we continue through the story, what we're going to get is a lot of psychological realism, which means we're going to be in the interior landscapes of these characters. But then we're also going to move outward because, well, that's where these traumatic experiences that are still shaping the lives and the psyches of these people come in. If you want to think back to Tony's story, remember Tony's story by Leslie Marmon Silko involved a Native American who seems to have kind of a psychological break after he has a confrontation with a policeman with these mirrored glasses. If you recall, what we talked about when we talked about that story was the fact that, well, maybe an earlier trauma, maybe an earlier sense of trauma for all Native Americans encountering those authority figures is kind of feeding into the disorientation and trauma that our protagonist, Tony, feels. We have a similar situation here. The very beginning begins with our young narrator, and part one begins with Sonia, who is the young girl losing her key to her house. And this kind of leads to a situation in which these kids are on the streets. And what we see from the very beginning paragraph is that there are certain rules that this girl follows, right? One of those rules is the police is not anybody that you want to put your hands in, right? So already we've got these barriers between us, those immigrants, and them, the police, or the other way around. And remember, in this story, we're going to move around from point of view to point of view, and each section is going to give us a different scenario, and it's going to give us a different point of view. But what we end up with is a cluster, right? And this cluster of narratives is meant to help us examine the death of one character. That is the young boy Geraldo that our mother is still feeling, still has at the forefront of pretty much everything she does as she maneuvers these maze of streets, this very disorienting landscape that she finds herself in. And if we notice, the police are a definite threat, and the entire city is very disorienting. For instance, if you look at page 159, the very bottom paragraph reads, "They entered a maze of alleys and dead ends, the long abandoned warehouses shadowing any light." Our author, wants readers to feel as displaced and disoriented as our characters feel, right? In other words, these are immigrants from another country, forced to come into the United States in the dead of night, forced to hide, forced to run. And the disorientation that ensues is part of what we are supposed to be feeling. By the time we get to part 2, and we hear that this shift in point of view kind of takes over, and now we're dealing with the point of view of the owner of the cafe, we see how he exemplifies loss as well. Loss is a theme that all of these characters share. Look at the double zeros that he talks about, right? Those are physical markers of absence. Very first paragraph in part 2 on page 160. By the end of that paragraph. But now if you take a look at the sign, the paint's peeled off except for 2 of the O's, the double zero cafe, story of my life, right? What's missing, right? What is missing is his child. Very similar to the child who has been murdered, right? This is our protagonist's child, Geraldo, who somehow seeps into everything that this woman is trying to do in the present, which means that you have this past historical episode that's pretty much speaking very much to the actions of at least one of our protagonists, and probably the owner of the cafe in the present. And one interesting thing about the cafe is that the cafe has been a place of violence itself, right? Violence seems to be all around this city. As we move on, we see that the cafe owner is very suspicious of these children, right? He doesn't trust. He finds it very difficult to trust these people. And he sees them only in terms of objects. They are dirty. They don't speak the language. They are othered in his narrative. And he drinks, right? By the time we get to page 162, we see that he is not entirely stable. And eventually, this is the character who is going to turn in this unnamed mother and her 2 children. But look at the way that he imagines these characters. They are dehumanized. For instance, at the bottom of 162, in that paragraph 30, by about the end, he says, "I see all these illegals running out of the factory to hide like roaches when the light switch goes on." Again, the dehumanization of these immigrants, of these humans, is center stage throughout this story. And our cook tells us again and again and again, I'm a nice guy, right? Well, maybe he is a nice guy. He has also suffered loss. He has also been through a certain amount of trauma with the loss of his own son. And we're not sure why he makes that call in the end that actually betrays our mother and her young children. By the time we get to part 3, we have a different narrator. And this seems to be our mother. And this is where the paragraph or part 3 begins with, he's got lice, probably from living in the detainers. Those are the rooms where they round up children and make them work for their food. I saw them from the window. Their eyes are cut glass, and no one looks for sympathy. They take turns, sorting out the arms from the legs, head from the torsos. Is that one your mother? One guard asks, holding a mummified head with eyes shut tighter than coffins. But the children no longer cry. These are horrifying images. They've moved us beyond the story that's taking place in this time and place. Now we're somewhere in El Salvador. Now we're in some civil war, and all of these images are coming back to this mother as she's trying to maneuver this space, right? Now, instead of moving in, we're moving out. And this is where we see the Llorona figure come in. By paragraph 35, the darkness becomes a serpent's tongue, swallowing us whole. It is the night of La Llorona. The women come up from the depths of sorrow to search for their children. I join them. She's telling us she is joining all of these women who are searching for their missing children. I join them, frantic, desperate, and our eyes become scrutinizers, our bodies opiated with the scent of their smiles. Descending from door to door, the wind whips our faces. I hear the wailing of the women and know it to be my own, right? So now she has cast herself as one of these Llorona figures. And now she's talking to this policeman or this authority figure. And again, we get some of that very, very strange language. Top of 164, this authority figure is saying, we arrest spies, criminals. This is no longer just the Caribou Cafe. This is, again, a landscape beyond the Caribou Cafe. By the middle of the story, or by the middle of the page on 164, Contras are tricksters. They exploit the ignorance of people like you. Now that's another context clue that we've moved out of this landscape. We're not in the cafe anymore. We're in some past detention center. We're in some past detainment center where this woman is being interrogated by some authority figure. Because we have all of these conflicting images. And by the time we get to 164, this theme of displacement and dispossession is very, very realized. For instance, page 165, paragraph 60. These four walls are no longer my house. The earth beneath it, no longer my home. Weeds have replaced all good crops. The irrigation ditches are clotted with bodies. No matter where we turn, there are rumors facing us, and we try to live as best we can. Under the rule of men who rape women, then rip their fetuses from their bellies. Is this our home? Is this our country? Again, we've moved out. She has associated herself with a Llorona figure. And by the time we get to the end of the story, or maybe right before the end, maybe 167, we have another image of what may have happened to her son. And this is a really terrifying image of really brutal violence. Bottom of page 167, about paragraph 79. But her legs are heavy and she crushes Geraldo against her so tight as if she wants to conceal him in her body. Again, return him to her belly so that they will not castrate him and hang his small blue penis on her door. Not crush his face so that he is unrecognizable. Not bury him among the heaps of bones and ears and teeth and jaws, because no one but she cared to know that he cried. And that's also a link to what we read about with Gloria Anzaldúa and the chapter from today, How to Tame a Wild Tongue. In that chapter, Gloria Anzaldúa is very much talking about how women have historically been silenced and how she no longer wants to be silenced. She wants to use her serpent's tongue to cry out for vengeance or whatever it is that she wants. Finally, by the end of the story on page 168, what happens is that our narrator, our female narrator, our mother, is completely aligned with the Llorona figure. And so she is acting as a figure who is screaming, wailing for all those lost children, not just her own. So 168, the very top. The cook huddles behind the counter, frightened, trembling. Their faces become distorted, and she doesn't see the huge hand that takes hold of Geraldo. And she begins screaming all over again, screaming so that the walls shake, screaming enough for all the women of murdered children, screaming, pleading for help from the people outside. And so what this woman has done is moved from that position of silenced object to a speaking subject, right? She screams enough for all mothers of all murdered children. And so when you read through the scholarly essay on La Llorona Dines at the Caribou Cafe, that should really help you bring together some of these very complex ideas. Thank you for listening.